Testing my new switch mechanism, I thought I'd created something that required very little force to operate. Unfortunately, the clutched gear required even less force to slip, so I geared it down further, from 2:1 to 7:1, which got it running. However, using a 3.5:1 gear ratio after the clutched gear in the tunnel mechanism resulted in the lift arms doing their best to continue rotating instead of slipping the clutch. This could result in gears skipping and lift arms becoming desynchronized, so I had to increase the ratio to 2:1, giving me only a 4:1 ratio for the switches, which sadly wasn't enough. I did try going back to the 3.5:1 ratio, which would be reduced to 7:1 between mechanisms, but found this actually also wasn't strong enough to run both mechanisms together. If I rotated the cams by hand, it would drive both systems, so maybe if I focused on driving the cams first, I'd have better luck. This did drive both mechanisms, except I had the same problem I had earlier of the clutch not stalling when there was a jam. I could maybe increase the force on the switches using even longer levers and larger cams, but you've got to set limits somewhere. So I needed a system that provided very little force to the first mechanism and much larger force to the second, while only reducing the speed by half. Kind of an impossible task with gears alone, but I had an idea between streams of bringing in a second motor between the mechanisms. Each motor would have a clutch and a combined force enough to rotate the cams, but if either motor was stalled, the cams would stop. I got the first mechanism working perfectly, but after several hours of designing and building the second mechanism, the two systems again failed to work together. After this session, I realised I'd actually forgotten part of my plan. I'd seen systems that would engage with one of two outputs depending on the direction of the input, and figured I could utilise this to bridge outputs. If output B was to be disconnected unless output A was outputting, then output B could be reduced by an 80:1 ratio, giving it more than enough torque to push the levers. I realised what I was trying to build here was an AND logic gate, and did check YouTube for solutions, but only found a couple of very complex and self-proclaimed bad examples. So how could I utilise the output selector? I thought using 8-tooth gears on a short arm would require gears to be too close together for bridging, and might not handle torque as well as larger gears. But larger gears and longer arms would be heavier and more difficult to move. I could use a gear with a clutch to swing an arm with the gear into place, but the gear wouldn't drop away if the output stopped. I tested whether an elastic band could pull the arm back when unpowered, but it created a strange intermittent movement. It was also pretty slow to move and engage. I needed something much snappier. I found online a much lighter clutch using a friction pin that allowed the arm to drop. While it initially looked promising, it became apparent that it wasn't too reliable, and it seemed reluctant to let go of the other gears once engaged. I did get it running a secondary set of gears, but it wouldn't be of any use if it wouldn't disengage, so I again tried an elastic band on a sliding connector to adjust the tension. I also tested whether a smaller gear might disengage easier, but sadly didn't have any luck. I got wondering whether lifting the gear straight up might help disengaging, if the clutch would lift a gear rack instead of a lift arm. I put together a test rig which did appear to work, until I attached a motor to it. It seemed the gears were rotating back freely without the motor to hold them, rather than slipping the clutch. I tested whether an elastic band might help, but there was either too much tension in the band or too much friction in the clutch. I wondered how the clutch in an automatic car worked, which led me to YouTube in search of Lego torque converters. Sadly, I didn't find any usable examples, but I did come across an example of a torque damper. This didn't appear to be of any use until they added in a second rubber axle. As the motor sped up, the axles began to flex, drawing in the second cam and a gear connected to it. Maybe this could be used to pull a gear into place. Unfortunately, it didn't really perform under testing, only moving the output axle by the smallest amount. I did also find a couple of mechanisms that used centrifugal force to push out and expand parts, creating connections that could drive external components. This felt way beyond my ability, so I found myself revisiting the swing arm idea. I was having a little more luck with a new test frame I'd built, but reliability was still an issue, with the gear on the arm occasionally bouncing off the powered gear or failing to disengage. I decided to test it with the lever pushing system, which for a few rocky moments didn't look very promising. But then...
It's trying. Oh, there we go.
Hallelujah!
It's not falling away though.
Well, I'd still say this was progress. So the gears were occasionally refusing to release the swing arms gear, which I figured was something to do with teeth pushing and pulling up on each other. How would the gears respond if they were face to face on separate axles, and the swing arm had 2 gears to bridge them? Well, it worked when I manually operated it, and the clutch did have enough power to lift the arm, but unfortunately the driving gear was repelling the gears on it.